Hi, how you doing? Today I thought we'd talk about Zone 3 sun perennials. And these would be the perennials that would get over 6 hours of full sun every day and rock solid hardy to Zone 3 with no extra winter protection or no extra measures taken. I sometimes think that as Zone 3 gardeners, we feel like we're missing out on some of the fabulous perennials that are out there. And you know, for sure, not everything is hardy for us. Certainly not like maybe a Zone 6 would be, but we have um, we have a ton of choices. And as I was going through my list and my 14,000 photos to see what I could add to this video, I had to whittle it down because we do have so many choices. And unless you want a 4-hour video, you know, I had to whittle it down, and I thought, wow, we have excellent selection of perennials to grow in our gardens in the summer. My name is Sharon. I garden on a large yard in a small town in east central Saskatchewan, Zone 3. Welcome to my Sask Garden. Perennials, for those of you who may not know, you might be a new gardener, that perennial means that it's going to come back every year and it's going to grow and bloom every year. And at some point they can be divided, not all of them, because some of them have a taproot, like a carrot would be a taproot, for example, and so some of them cannot be divided, but for the most part they can be divided. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about only what I have experience with. So this is by no means an all-inclusive list. There's certainly more perennials out there that I have not tried, some of which I'd like to try, and if I come across them, I probably will try them at some point. And some of what I'm going to talk about and include photos of, I actually no longer grow, but I'm going to include that because as I was reviewing this list, I thought, why don't I grow these? And so I'd like to grow them again. So I'm going to be sharing photos from the last number of years, as well as I've taken some screenshots of new varieties and options to look for the future. So the first perennial I'm going to talk about is, of course, peonies, because how can we not include these divas and make them, the very first thing that we talk about? I think probably every yard has a peony. If you don't, you should get one because they really are beautiful flowers. And the fact that they bloom early, I think that's a big part of it too. There's this massive, beautiful flower that comes out sometime in June or usually toward the end of June is when mine bloom anyway. There's some earlier blooming ones too. There are three kinds of peonies. There are herbaceous peonies, which is the kind most of us know. They're the kind that die down to the ground every winter. They're readily available. Sometimes they don't even have names. They just say pink peony or white peony or Sarah Bernhardt. Many of us would have Sarah in our yard, and that is a herbaceous peony. So the next one after that is a tree peony, which has woody stems, and then the third type is an Ito peony. And an Ito peony is a cross between an herbaceous peony and a tree peony. All three of those peonies have beautiful foliage and beautiful blooms. So herbaceous peonies are the most common. They're big plants, nice foliage. Like I said, they die to the ground every winter. They bloom mid-June to early July. Last year the peonies in my yard didn't even start blooming until early July because it was such a cold June. The blossoms can be single or double or somewhere in between. But those big doubles and bomb type, as beautiful as they are often really heavy flowers, and they can be on weak stems. And so if it rains, those blooms get heavier and fall to the ground. I cut a good many of these types for cut flowers for the house, and I also save peony buds in the fridge for future flower bouquets throughout the summer. When the time comes, I'll be I'll be doing a video and guiding you through that if you're not aware of how to do it. Um, and I do that. I cut them from the plant because I enjoy them a lot more in the house. I see them more often in the house than out in the yard, and they just take the weight off of the plant. And I don't have to worry so much that all the flowers are going to be laying on the ground if it decides to rain. But going forward, if I were to buy more peonies, they would be something like this, with single anemone or Japanese type flowers and strong stems that hold up the flowers. The tree peonies have woody stems like a shrub, and the new growth pops out from those stems. So they have woody stems, and then they have soft growth that grows out from those woody stems. They bloom in June with huge, nice flowers that are unscented, and the herbaceous peonies, very often the flowers are scented. I have 2 of these tree peonies. I've had them for many years, no protection, and I'm going to say that they are hardy, fully hardy. They're not protected in any way. They're not in a overly protected spot or anything like that. One year, the woody stems died right back over winter. They were dead come spring. I trimmed everything off and the plants grew back. They didn't bloom that year, but they have bloomed every year since. Again, the blooms are not as plentiful on the tree peony as they are on herbaceous peonies. But for sure, if I were to come across any of these peonies again, I wouldn't hesitate to buy them. Ito peonies are becoming more and more popular, and they're not as difficult to find now as they once were. They are still rather expensive. The Bartzella, like the one that's pictured here, is probably the best known at the moment. They have very strong stems and massive flowers, again, unscented. Perhaps not as long-lasting in a vase, if you were to pick it as a cut flower, as the herbaceous peonies are. I have a Bartzella. I moved it, and it is now struggling for, I think, its 3rd year since I moved it. The next queens of the perennial garden are Asiatic lilies. And these are the most common lilies that we see, the Asiatics. There's many kinds of lilies. I'll just get into that in a minute. The Asiatic lilies come in many heights and many colors. They are mostly upward facing, but there are some that face downwards. They're quite tall and they face downwards. Asiatic lilies have some of the brightest and showiest flowers for a Zone 3 garden, and they are truly beautiful. They really make a statement when they're mass planted. One downfall for me is they bloom, well, I imagine for all of us, is they bloom in the heat of July, and so sometimes the blooms just don't really last. There are also other kind of lilies. Asiatic is only one type. The next ones would be Oriental lilies, and they have their own set of requirements really to be fully hardy in a Zone 3. They're later to emerge, and they're a little later to bloom than the Asiatics. They need to be planted somewhere where the soil warms early so that the growth is pushed early. The south or west sides of buildings are ideal. After they bloom, lilies should have at least 6 weeks for the stems to begin to die down before frost sets in and kills the foliage, because that dying down of the foliage feeds the bulbs for next year's growth. So if your plants are just beginning to bloom in September and then they freeze quickly after that, or perhaps even while they're still blooming because they're blooming late, then that bulb will slowly deplete after a year or two, and eventually it's not going to come up at all. I have some Orientals now growing on the south side of the house in a big raised bed, and they are blooming in early to mid-August. I've had them elsewhere in the yard where they have not thrived because they emerge and bloom too late. I also have some on the west side of the garage that have been coming back and blooming for a few years now. So that's why I say also on the west side of buildings. I think it's just the soil warms earlier in those places, and therefore that bulb needs a certain soil temperature before it's going to start to push up. And so if you can manage that somewhere, that would be the place to plant them. I also planted a few last year on the south side of the greenhouse because, again, it just warms a little earlier there, and they're going to have a better chance. There are also trumpet lilies, which in my opinion are really only marginally hardy in zone 3, the full-on trumpet lilies. There's also crosses, and that's a whole new division of lily, and they are either OA, which would be Oriental Asiatic cross, or OT, which is Oriental trumpet cross. And so there are these lilies as well. I've not found all the crosses to be strong, that they kind of get smaller year after year. The first couple of years, that's what the lily trees are, is Oriental trumpet hybrids, and some catalogs have marketed them as a tree, and they're really nothing new. They're just a cross between two types of lilies, but you have to treat them very much the same as you would an Oriental lily, in that you need to plant them somewhere where they're going to shoot up early and bloom earlier in the season, or at least not late in the season, so that they still get that dying down period to feed the bulb for next year. In any case, the Orientals, the trumpets, and any of those crosses should be planted in a zone 3 garden, should be spring planted. The Asiatics you can plant in the fall, but all the rest of them you should spring plant them, so that they really get a good root system and settle in prior to winter. There's also the June blooming Martagon lilies, but I talked about those in the shade perennials video because they actually prefer a dappled sun or partly shady area to bloom. So if you've not seen that video, I will link it below. I'm just going to give you a word of caution before you dive into getting a lot of lily bulbs, and that is there's a pest. It's known as the scarlet lily beetle, or the red lily beetle, and it's exactly how it sounds. It's bright red. It's a little beetle, and it will decimate your lily bulbs throughout the yard. It's very hard to control this bulb, or this bug, and they will eat all your foliage and flowers. Then they drop to the ground very easy. I guess they're hard to catch. And then they lay eggs in the soil surrounding the bulb. And next year, as your shoot is emerging, it's already got lily beetle larvae all over it that is eating the foliage so that they can grow and mature. I've not had trouble with these. I've not had these in my yard yet, and I'm knocking on wood for sure, because they've moved in. I don't know, I don't even know if it's 10 years now that I've been hearing about the lily beetle. I'm ever vigilant in my yard. I check the lilies frequently, and not just when they're in bloom. I check them while they're, as they're emerging, and while they're growing, and after the bloom. I always check them to make sure that there is no evidence of that lily beetle. And it looks like the evidence is very apparent that you have trouble. There's going to be holes, and all your foliage is going to be eaten, and then the larvae they look disgusting. They look like poop all over the lily stem. So anyways, that is my word of caution about those. If you are bothered by the lily beetle, or you want to educate yourself on the lily beetle, the Lily Nook website from Manitoba. Anyway, I think it's Brandon. They have an excellent article on their website about the lily beetle, ways to control it. It's a very informative article, and I'll link that in the description box below. Also, be really cautious trading or buying lilies that are not from a reputable source, because they can come in on the bulb as well, or on the plant that may have been dug up from another person's yard. Nobody really knows that they might be there until they start eating the foliage. So it could be quite innocent, that someone would not know that they're trading a bug-infested lily bulb with you. If you have lilies, or if you're looking to get them, school yourselves on the lily beetle, because they are definitely a pest that is in zone 3 and sounds like they're just thriving. Also, if you want to drool over lilies, go to that Lily Nook website to look at all the different varieties and kinds that there are. They are beautiful. I'm not affiliated with Lily Nook in any way. I have ordered from them in the past. They have exceptional uh, lily bulbs that they sell, and it's free to look and dream on a cold winter's day. The next plant I'll talk about is Delphinium. This is a fairly standard, big, stately, beautiful stand of flowers in a Zone 3 garden. They are fully cold hardy. Many of them can get to 5 feet or more, and wind can be a problem. So it's best to take this into consideration with if you're going to grow these tall ones, keep that in mind and shelter them. Try to find a place where they're sheltered from the prevailing wind. Also, the delphinium worm can cause trouble with the plants. I don't know if everybody has trouble with these, but I do. They kind of get leaves that stick together almost with webbing, and if you were to pry apart that leaf, you'd find a worm inside there. And they can do the same thing, destroy mostly the flowers more so, or the growing tips more so than the actual foliage on the plant. The next one I'll talk about is the globe thistle, which is Echinops. And this grows ridiculously easy in my yard. I have some deep in the trees where they grow and bloom, and some out in the open where they're certainly not bothered by drought or heat or sun from absolutely morning until night. That little blue globe that you see there is full of spiky things, and each one of them will open up into a tiny little flower. It is pretty and it's interesting, and it's always asked about by people who don't know the plant. I'm going to say make sure you remove the spent thistles or the spent flowers because they will also seed out, and that's a reason why they grow so ridiculously easy in my yard. It has lots of foliage. It's almost shrub-like in appearance, and it blooms in mid-August, and I'm going to say it gets to maybe about 30 inches tall, maybe a little more. They're very, very big plants, and the blooms are really quite interesting. Purple coneflower. I think we should all know this one. It's echinacea, and also known as purple coneflower or just plain coneflower. The old standard is Echinacea purpurea, which can be grown from seed, but powwow wildberry also can be grown from seed, and I think it's a much nicer flower than the old standard. There's many varieties of echinacea now. Not all state to be hardy to zone 3, so if you're buying one in a store, make sure you read the tag. Magnus is another one hardy to zone 3, and for something different, green twister is pretty interesting looking, and it also can be grown from seed, and it's hardy to zone 3. I bought Sunseeker's Bubblicious 2 years ago. It looks quite a bit like powwow wildberry, I think. And the Sunseeker's Rainbow I planted late last year, so we'll see how that comes back. Purple coneflower are very long blooming and well worth having in the yard. Rudbeckia it's actually a favorite of mine. Now, there's a few kinds of Rudbeckia. Some are annual and some are perennial, and then there's some annual ones that act like perennial. I have a few annual Rudbeckia that have come back, several years now, probably at least 3. I'll take it, whatever. The true perennial Rudbeckia are not necessarily all hardy to zone 3. Goldsturm is the perennial I grow. It's sometimes referred to as brown-eyed Susan or black-eyed Susan. And Goldsturm was the Perennial Plant Association Perennial of the Year in 1999. It's fairly easy to find. It's also easily grown from seed, which I did. although it will take 2 to 3 years to increase in size. The third year in my yard provided a very nice show. It's very long blooming. It started blooming in August. They start blooming in August and they go through right until very hard frost. And even after that, the cones on them are interesting. Because it can be started from seed, it also has a chance of self-sowing in the yard. But I've not really found it to be a pest in that regard, probably because it is later blooming and maybe the seed heads don't quite have a chance to mature enough to spread themselves far and wide, starting earlier in the year. But certainly if you're concerned about it self-sowing, just nip off those seed heads. Yarrow is Achillea millefolium. These are for sure plants that can handle heat, drought, and poor soil. And they probably grow best in those kinds of conditions, because if they're grown with too much moisture, too rich a soil, they can flop in the middle. Yarrow has a reputation of being invasive, and the old varieties will grow quickly and they will also seed out with wild abandon. I don't currently grow any yarrow, mostly because of the seeding out issue and also how incredibly fast they grow in my yard. And in this photo you can see the yellow yarrow. I think, that was only a year or two of those perennials, and they made quite a mass planting very quickly. There are some new varieties on the market now. Proven Winners has several beautiful colors, and Proven Winner plants don't generally produce viable seed. I can't attest to that with yarrow just yet, but I do plan to try 2 or 3 of the brightly colored named cultivars to see how they do. These new varieties all seem to say they're hardy only to zone 4, which actually surprises me. Maybe they haven't been extensively tested as far back as zone 3. I'd be surprised to not see a yarrow come back in zone 3. So those old varieties, the seed-grown varieties, those for sure are hardy to zone 2 or hardy to zone 3. Actually, they might be zone 2. I often think that, I say I'm in zone 3, but it hasn't been that long ago that this area was always considered a zone 2B. So, when I say things that for the past 20 years have been hardy to zone 3, they're actually hardy to zone 2. This next photo is baby's breath, which is gypsophilia. A lot of people don't like to grow it because it has a reputation of seeding out. This one in particular, it looks like just a cloud of soft pink that eventually fades to white. And this is Rosy Vale. It does not produce seeds. It's fully hardy. I've had some of these plants for, I bet you, 25 years. It has a taproot, so they don't take well to being dug up and moved. And I don't trim it back until spring. And in this photo here, they're growing with blue oak grass, which is Halictotrichon sempervirens. The next perennial is bush clematis, and that is Clematis integrifolia. And it doesn't vine. It's still kind of floppy a little. It has like the same kind of stem as a regular clematis, sort of viney, but then it stops at about maybe 2 feet tall. And so you do need to help it stay upright. I just use a tomato cage, and that tomato cage just gets covered up. You can't even see it's there after the plant gets going and fills out a bit. This one is a seed-grown variety, and the seedlings, when I grew them, produced a variety of colors, to pink and purple and blue. But in my yard, again, they self-sow like crazy. And part of that is because the seed heads are just so beautiful that they're hard to prune away. They're also blooming at the same time as producing seed heads because they have a long bloom period. So it's a little bit more difficult with those to just get in and prune away the seed heads. I've been ridding my yard of these particular plants, but there are now some named cultivars that I read they don't produce seed. I'd like to try one of these from the Stand By Me series from Proven Winners that comes in blue, lilac, and pink. They look like they have a much heavier bloom as well than the seed-grown varieties. The next perennial that is probably not that well known is Erigeron or Erigeron, and that is fleabane. It's an old perennial. I think I'm going to say that because, you know, I'm old and I've known it for a long time. So these photos that I have are from a number of years ago when I did grow this perennial, and I honestly don't really recall why I don't grow it anymore. But while going over all these photos, I thought, wow, you know, this is one that I should grow again and source out the seeds and get it going. It was a great perennial. Maybe a little floppy at times, but otherwise it was really easy care and provided a really nice bright spot in the flower bed in mid-July. Sedum is an excellent perennial for dry locations and full sun locations. They really are. They're also known as stone crop. And there's the tall upright varieties, and there's the low creepers that just creep along the ground. And then there's ones in between as well. There's tons of varieties. Not all state to be hardy to zone 4, so just watch for that when you're looking at tags. But for the tall varieties, Autumn Joy is probably best known. I think this is one of the best perennials going because it has such a long season of interest. The flowers start out lime green, and then they slowly mature to pink. And then with the cool weather and frost in autumn, they just flame up. And if you are growing it, if you have it in your yard, you'll know that it is a magnet for pollinators. Then finally, there's also the creeping sedums, and you can take your pick. There are tons of varieties of creeping sedum, although again, not all necessarily hardy to zone 3. But if you have a hot, dry area that needs something low with long season interest, for sure take a look at sedum. The tall sedums only need to be cut back once in spring when the growth starts, and the creeping sedums don't even need that. Here's another perennial that may not be that widely known, and that is Doronicum, and that's commonly known as leopard's bane. I'm going to mention this one because it's pretty easy to grow from seed, and it's also pretty. It has no problem with hardiness. Mine grew in mostly sun with a little bit of midday dappled shade from a tree. It's just not one that I see often for sale, and I think it may be overlooked as a great hardy perennial that blooms early. It blooms about the time the lilacs and ornamental onion are blooming, and that contrast, especially with the ornamental onion, is really nice. It will seed out, so cutting back the spent blooms it would be required maintenance through the summer. Next, I'll talk about hens and chicks. The Latin name is sempervirens, which means live forever. I've got a fairly substantial collection of hens and chicks. I bought a bunch from a bunch of different cultivars from a grower in Ontario many years ago. And I think I have the right type of soil and location. I've not found any to be not hardy. They all are. I find them to be very easy to grow as long as they're given a well-drained area in full sun. I think if they're watered too much or they sit in a low spot, they could rot. They make large mats if you let them, so they can be a good ground cover if you wanted that kind of thing. I do get the odd weed that pops up through, usually easily pulled. On these, when the mother plant blooms, that rosette that it blooms from dies, but the chicks that she produces just keep on growing. I don't really like the blooms, so I often cut them off anyway. If you need a few more of this plant, you just pull a few up. They are easily moved, and if you have too many, you can do these kinds of fun things with them. Here's some old gardening boots and sneakers that are getting a second life. The hens and chicks need little soil to grow, I found, but in my yard they don't winter above ground in a pot without sufficient snow cover. Phlox paniculata, that's the tall phlox. In good conditions, it can get to 3 feet and just be covered with beautiful blossoms in a variety of colors nowadays. The older varieties are prone to powdery mildew, but newer ones aren't bothered as much. I have the old favorite David, this white flowered one, and it doesn't seem to be troubled by powdery mildew. But then we don't really get that much humid weather these days for powdery mildew to thrive in. But now the new varieties of phlox, I have the Garden Girl series from Proven Winners is so far surviving in my yard, but I can't say yet that it's thriving. I'm hoping to find some in the Luminary series and try some of those. There's lots of nice colors here. I have Opalescence and it's doing well. There's also Veronica, which is also known as Speedwell. And this is the same. There's now many varieties out there and they come in all kinds of pinks and blues, colors, whites as well. They come in a lot of colors and they come in a lot of sizes. Some are taller, some are quite short. There's also some with silver foliage as well as green foliage. But what they all have in common is spiky flowers that open from the bottom up. I never used to grow these too much, but the more recent introductions with the brighter colors and the long-lasting blooms, they have me looking at them a lot more. I have Lightsaber shown here, which is nice and has a fairly long bloom period. And I also have a shorter one called Moody Blues. And just last August, I added Purple Illusion as well, so we'll see how that one does. I wouldn't mind adding any of the others in this series from Proven Winners. I also want to talk about catmint because I think this is a really good choice for some areas in the garden. Now, I grew catmint, which is Nepeta. I grew it from seed once, and that was a fiasco, and I'll never do that again. It's setting seed while it's still blooming because that's just the nature of how catmint grows. And also, it wasn't particularly vibrant in color, and but I'm still digging up seedlings from that, like I said, fiasco, because it certainly was. The catmint in the photo that I'm showing here is Walker's Low, which grew beautifully, but it's too big for me. It takes up too much room in a flower bed. So I've been looking for a smaller variety called Cat's Pajamas, but there are several Nepeta cultivars now, and I'm just showing a photo here of the many varieties, sizes, and colors that there are. I would recommend Walker's Low for a very large area where you need to cover a lot of area with a few plants. This catmint is not invasive. It has no seeds. They'll grow to a 4 or 5 foot circle, one plant. It also is a plant that likes lean soil, full sun, not a lot of moisture, and it can also flop open in the center if it's getting rich soil or too much moisture. It is easily cut back and a new flush of foliage starts. And you would actually see that as the plant is growing. It has a really long bloom period. I will also mention that this is not catnip. It's not, you're not going to have a bunch of cats coming to your yard and, getting high or whatever catnip does to cats. I don't know, but it's not the same as catnip. The next plant is Salvia nemorosa, or just salvia. And this is the plant that a lot of people don't like because the foliage is kind of smelly. I only find that it smells when you're working with it or cutting it back or something like that, or perhaps brushing against it if you had it along a path. But I don't really find that that if you're just standing next to it, it's not going to smell. It is very pretty. It's a good choice for an area with hot and dry soil and lean soil. This is another one that can flop if it's given too much moisture and rich soil. It seems like a lot of these sun perennials for zone 3 are kind of like that. They like a little bit tougher conditions to grow in. A couple of years ago, I bought Back to the Fuchsia, and I just love this plant. It starts blooming very early, and it keeps on blooming for a very long time. I cut it back, and there's some sporadic rebloom after that. It hasn't flopped in the middle for me. It has very strong stems, stands up really well to wind. This particular one, this Back to the Fuchsia, is in the Color Spires series from Proven Winners. And I've since bought Indigo Girl. There's a number of other colors in this series, and if they perform like Back to the Fuchsia, I'll take a couple of each, please. Next one I'll talk about is Heliopsis, or false sunflower. I grow summer sun, and I've been growing it for years and years. I have some very large stands of it. It will self-sow. That's why I have a lot of it, because seed heads aren't always cut off. You know, the birds like the seed heads, eh? So I tend to leave things for the birds, and then I kind of pay a price for that. Best thing about this plant is its incredibly long bloom period. I like to call it the workhorse of the garden. Now, it takes a minute for this plant to pop out of the ground in the spring. I do find that, but once it does, it gets going and it blooms fairly quickly. So I think it's going to start blooming mid-season, and it just keeps on blooming right through till frost. And the thing about it is, even the dried seed heads are decorative. They look like you could pick them and just put them in a vase, just like that. They dry perfectly. So I will put a note of caution here that summer sun, in particular, will seed out and naturalize. I bought another variety 2 years ago. I bought 2 plants of Burning Hearts, and I was surprised to see one didn't make it last year, which has now left me with just 1 plant. It grew okay. It's a little lanky for me, and I have a tomato cage to keep it upright. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt for now because it's young, and summer sun does this for me too when they're young plants. Another variety of Heliopsis is Lorraine Sunshine that has variegated foliage. I've never grown it, but I've seen it more than a time or two. It's fairly easy to find. Summer Sun is quite a tall plant, usually around 4 feet, and it's a great back of the border perennial. There are other varieties now that grow shorter, some only 2 feet, and they appear to all be hardy to zone 3, so they're worth looking at. And again, one of the longest blooming perennials I have. I'm going to mention a couple of varieties of stackies here, and the first one will be the lamb's ear. These velvety, soft silver leaves, they're just begging to be touched. It's a bee magnet when they bloom. They're great ground covers. Mine grows pretty happy in the shade on the north side of a shrub. Gets early morning and late afternoon sun. I usually pick off the blossoms as well, but it loves sun and is drought tolerant. It will seed out, which is why I pick off the blossoms. The other stackies, or betony, is this one, and this one in particular is Humelo. I bought this 3 years ago on a whim because, I had never heard of it, and it turns out it was the Perennial Plant Association's Plant of the Year in 2019. So far, mine has stayed in this clump, but in my reading it says to plant 12 to 18 inches apart for ground cover, so I'm assuming that it will spread, and I've read that it can spread by stolons. I've not found that to be the case. Perhaps this named cultivar is a little bit different. It grows about 16 inches. It's drought tolerant once it's established. Pretty pink spikes and blooms in July, mid-season. The next one is beard tongue, or penstemon. I never used to grow penstemon, mostly because they weren't really much of a perennial that I thought much about. But then I bought Onyx and Opal, this cultivar, and now I'm smitten. This plant is a proven winner variety and hands down outperformed any other plant in the yard. First of all, those dark leaves are just gorgeous. They're substantial. They're kind of thick. It's a big plant. It's got really strong stems that hold up to any wind that Saskatchewan can blow. The flowers are beautiful against the foliage, flowers for a long time. But even after it's done flowering, those seed heads are beautiful, and they can be left on the plant or picked off and used for a dried arrangement. It's a tall plant, probably between 3 and 4 feet, and the foliage lasted and lasted and lasted. It survived many frosts. I have Midnight Masquerade as well, which also has the dark leaves and the pinkish blooms. But it came back a little slow last year. It was also much shorter than this onyx and opal. And also I have Dark Towers, but I only added that late last summer. And so I don't know how that one is going to perform yet for this zone. But I highly recommend Onyx and Opal. It's an outstanding plant. We can't forget about daylilies. Daylilies are not true lilies, but rather they are hemerocallis. They are not a bulb like Asiatic lilies. They come in all sizes and colors, all with strappy green, kind of grassy looking stems, and just a myriad of flower types. Each flower lasts only a day, which is why they're called daylilies, but some breeding now has them lasting just a little bit longer. Some flowers are held up very high above the plant, up to 3 feet, and some stay low down, just on top of the foliage. I had one I had to toss because the flowers were well inside the foliage, which didn't please me very much, so that one got shovel pruned. I think they're all pretty much hardy to zone 3. They're all easy to grow. They're all very forgiving in all kinds of conditions, including too wet and too dry. As long as, either of those, as long as it's not consistently that way. They're often a perennial recommended for part sun or even for shade, but I would disagree somewhat in that their bloom in part sun is much less. I've moved most of mine now into full sun where they bloom nicely. Most of them are August bloomers, and I rely on them for color in the yard during that time. I'm going to mention bearded iris here. The tall bearded iris, they are not all hardy, easily hardy for zone 3. I think they possibly could be, but sometimes extra measures have to be taken. Those tall bearded ones, they are the queens of iris for sure. And I think that in a June garden, they rival the peonies for most beautiful bloom. They're also, some of them are scented. They're just not all hardy. It depends on the variety. And I have some that have been no trouble at all. Year after year, they come up and bloom. And then I have others that I've planted right next to those hardy ones, a different variety that I've planted, and they die. So they are not all, the tall bearded are not all fully hardy. But I wouldn't hesitate to recommend the earlier blooming short bearded iris for anyone in zone 3. They are all seemingly all hardy, or at least the ones I've grown are. And they take a lot of abuse from overcrowding, shade, and drought. I'm going to say iris's downfall is the constant need for dividing the rhizomes. It's easy enough to do, it's not difficult, but if you're not into that, then perhaps that's not the plant for you. So, there's more. Like I said, I couldn't include absolutely everything in this video, or it would have been a really long video. There's the daisies, like the classic white Shasta daisies, or those nice bright pink and red painted daisies. Those are beautiful flowers. I used to grow a lot of those as well. Might have to look into that again too. I didn't touch really, except for the blue oak grass, I didn't touch on the ornamental grasses, and one that we often see, or that's often asked about, what is that grass? It's beautiful. It's often Carl Forrester, which is Calamagrostis. Carl Forrester also has some siblings. There's Overdam and Avalanche. Another one called El Dorado. That's a really nice one. It's got a brighter green leaf with a yellow stripe in it. That's a nice one. Then there's also all the rock garden plants. Those are all sun perennials. Most of them are sun perennials. Um, there's all the vines, all the, clematis. And I'm talking about the border perennials, I guess, is what I'm going for in this video. So we have a ton of good choices in Zone 3 for sun perennials. Do I wish that I could grow some others? Yeah, for sure I do. I just don't know where I'd find the room. Thanks so much for watching today. I hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring. If you did enjoy it, give me a thumbs up, tell your friends, and hit that subscribe button. Thanks again. See you.